I've carried a heavy secret for decades, and the weight of it has only grown heavier with time. Today, I am finally ready to unburden my soul and confess. My name is Margaret, and I cheated on my husband while he was away fighting for our country. Even now, saying those words aloud fills me with shame and sorrow. But I need to tell the truth, no matter how painful, because I've lived with the guilt for far too long, and perhaps my story can keep someone else from making the same mistake. I met John in the summer of 1966 in our small Kansas hometown. We had been friends since childhood, but that year our friendship blossomed into love. He was 23 and I was 21, and he could light up any room with his easy smile. We spent warm evenings driving in his old pickup truck down country roads, listening to love songs on the radio, and talking about our dreams under the stars. Those were some of the happiest days of my life, and we imagined a beautiful future together. In early 1967, John enlisted in the Army. The Vietnam War was raging, and though he wasn't drafted, he felt it was his duty to serve. I admired his courage and patriotism, but I was terrified of losing him. Still, I supported his decision. We married at the courthouse 2 weeks before he left for basic training. I was proud of him, but as a new wife, I was already dreading the long separation and the danger ahead. In October 1967, a month after our wedding, John deployed to Vietnam. I remember the dawn at the bus station, the autumn chill in the air. He stood in his crisp green uniform with a duffel bag at his feet, and I clung to him, fighting back tears. "I'll come back to you, Maggie. I promise," he whispered. "I'll come back to you." I tried to be brave, but when the bus arrived, I broke down and sobbed into his chest. He lifted my chin, kissed me softly, and said, "Be brave for me." I watched as the bus drove away, carrying my heart with it. After he left, life became a blur of worry and routine. I moved back to my parents' farm and tried to keep busy with chores by day. But every night I lay awake in my old bed, staring at the ceiling and praying for John's safety under those distant stars. I learned to dread the evening news and the sight of a telegram courier, fearing they'd bring word that John had been killed. His letters were my lifeline. They arrived sporadically, but each one was a treasure. He wrote about the heat and monsoon rains, about how thoughts of me kept him going through the worst days. He told me to keep dreaming of our future, a little house by an oak tree, a family, a porch swing. I'd read his words over and over, smiling and crying at the same time, holding the paper to my heart, as if I could feel him near. As 1968 began, the war intensified and John's letters became less frequent. The Tet Offensive erupted, and I realized with dread that he was right in the middle of the fiercest fighting. I spent my 22nd birthday alone, the house silent except for the distant drone of the radio. Loneliness set in like a permanent resident. I tried to be brave, but some days I could hardly get out of bed. The emptiness and anxiety were overwhelming. During those difficult months, I found some companionship in a familiar face, Michael, a mechanic who had gone to school with us. Because of a medical issue, he hadn't been drafted and stayed behind in town. We'd run into each other at the post office or market, and he always asked about John with genuine concern. Seeing how overwhelmed I was, he started offering to help out around the farm. At first, I only accepted small favors. He fixed a broken fence, changed the oil in my car. He was kind and respectful, and I was grateful for the helping hand. We were both lonely in our own way, and over time, his visits grew more frequent. I began to look forward to those moments of friendly conversation. It was a brief respite from my constant worry. One rainy evening in the spring of 1968, the power went out at the farm. I was alone that night, and when Michael noticed the house was dark, he came by to check on me. We ended up sitting by the fireplace for light, sharing a bottle of wine to calm our nerves. For the first time in months, I actually laughed at some of his jokes, and the house felt a little less empty. As the rain beat down and the firelight flickered, an unexpected warmth grew between us. I remember him looking at me with gentle concern. And before I knew it, we were kissing. All the loneliness and longing I'd been suppressing surged up at once. I craved comfort, just to feel someone's arms around me again. In a haze of emotion, I let it happen. That night, I betrayed my husband's trust in the worst way. I sought solace in the arms of another man. I woke at dawn, with a sick feeling of shame twisting in my stomach. Michael was asleep beside me, and the reality of what I'd done hit me like a punch. I slipped out of bed and stood by the window, watching the gray morning light. I hardly recognized myself. How could I have done this? My husband was in a war zone, and I had been unfaithful to him in his own home. I started to cry, silent tears of regret streaming down my face. Michael woke to the sound of my sniffles and gently touched my shoulder. He murmured, "I'm so sorry, Maggie." He looked as guilt-ridden as I was. I couldn't even respond. I just shook my head and whispered for him to leave. After he quietly slipped out the door, I sank to the floor sobbing. I felt like the worst person in the world. In that moment, I prayed to God for forgiveness and swore to myself that I would never, ever repeat that mistake. No matter how lonely or desperate I felt, I would stay faithful from that day forward. A few weeks later, I received a letter from John that shattered me. He wrote that his unit had been ambushed in Quang Tri and that he'd watched his best friend die in his arms. John had narrowly survived and was grieving and traumatized. "Thinking of you is the only thing that keeps me sane," he wrote. I read that line over and over, and by the time I reached the end of the letter, my hands were shaking. Standing there on the porch, with his words in my trembling fingers, I finally grasped the full weight of what I had done. While he was facing death and hanging on to thoughts of me, I had betrayed him. The guilt and shame overwhelmed me. I broke down, right there on the wooden steps, sobbing until I could barely breathe. I begged God for a chance to make things right. Not long after that, in August 1968, I received word that John had been injured by shrapnel and was being sent home to recover. He was alive and coming home. Relief and terror washed over me in equal measure. I was so thankful that he was safe. But I knew I would soon have to face him and face myself with the awful secret I carried. John arrived home in September 1968. I'll never forget seeing him step off the plane. He looked thin and tired, with a cane supporting his injured leg, but he was alive, and he was still my John. I threw my arms around him the second he was close enough, careful not to hurt him. We both cried softly in each other's arms. He was awarded a Purple Heart, and the whole town hailed him as a hero for his service. John just shrugged off the praise modestly, saying he only did what any soldier would do for his brothers. He was still the humble, kind man I loved, only now with scars and shadows in his eyes from all he had been through. That first night, I helped him into our bed. He gave a scowl at how much I fussed over his pillows and bandages. Then he pulled me close. "I missed you so much," he whispered, voice cracking. I kissed him and told him I missed him too, my heart aching with love and remorse. I promised myself again, as I lay in his arms, that I would never hurt this man ever again. In the weeks that followed, we tried to build a normal life together. John had nightmares from the war and aches in his healing leg, but he was gentle and grateful to be home. Outwardly, I was the devoted wife, cooking his favorite meals, helping him with his physical therapy exercises, and smiling whenever he looked at me. But inside, I was drowning in guilt. Each time he thanked me for taking care of him, or each time I comforted him after a nightmare, A voice in my mind whispered that I was unworthy. I had failed him, and he didn't even know it. I told myself that maybe it was more merciful to keep the secret, that telling him would only hurt him more. I tried to act as if everything was fine, hoping my betrayal could be buried and left in the past. But secrets have a way of eating you alive. I would find myself in tears for no obvious reason, overwhelmed by what I was hiding. I even went to church one afternoon when the sanctuary was empty, lit a candle and begged God to guide me. I realized I couldn't carry the guilt alone forever. Still, I was terrified that telling John the truth would destroy the fragile peace we had. I kept waffling day after day, too afraid to speak. The breaking point came on a quiet evening in early 1970. We were in the kitchen after dinner, washing dishes together. The radio was playing Unchained Melody in the background, and John was humming along softly as he dried a plate. I watched him from the corner of my eye. This sweet, good man who had been through so much, and my heart just cracked. My hands began to tremble violently. A glass slipped and shattered in the sink. John turned to me, alarmed. "Maggie, are you all right?" he asked, concern in his voice. That simple question, asked with so much love, broke the dam inside me. I felt a sob rising in my chest, and tears blurred my vision. I put down the dish towel, knowing what I had to do, what I should have done long before. My heart was hammering. I took a shaky breath and tried to speak. Finally, I blurted out, "I have to tell you something terrible." He looked at me in confusion and dread. I could barely get the words out, but there was no turning back. "When you were gone, I wasn't faithful to you, John." The kitchen went so quiet, you could hear the tick of the clock on the wall. He just stared at me, not moving, not saying anything. I will never forget the look on his face, like he'd been struck hard across the soul. After a long, heavy silence, he finally spoke, his voice a fragile whisper. "What do you mean?" he asked, as if he needed me to say the exact words. I could feel my throat tightening with grief and shame. I was with someone else, I admitted, my voice barely audible. "Only once, and it's my greatest regret. I'm so sorry." John's face went pale, then flush, as the meaning of my confession sank in. He stepped back from me like I was someone he didn't recognize. His jaw worked as if he wanted to say something, but at first nothing came out. He let out a short, bitter, a sound of pure hurt and disbelief. "Michael," he finally muttered, his voice harsh. It was Michael, wasn't it? I nodded miserably, tears pouring down my cheeks. A flicker of anguish crossed his face. I knew Michael had been a friend of his long ago. John's eyes welled up with tears and he looked away, pressing his hand over his mouth. "How could you do that to me?" he whispered, his voice quavering with hurt. I reached out toward him, my hands shaking, but he pulled back. "I have no excuse," I cried. "It was a terrible mistake, the worst mistake of my life. I was lonely and I was afraid and I messed up so badly. But I never stopped loving you, not for a moment. Please, please forgive me somehow." I was sobbing uncontrollably by then, words tumbling out in desperation. I would have gotten on my knees and begged if I thought it would make a difference. John's eyes were overflowing with tears now. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw heartbreak and anger and love all at once. His lips parted like he was going to say something, but then they pressed together in a hard line. He wiped a tear from his cheek, and his face hardened with resolve. I need to get out of here," he choked out. His voice sounded broken. He turned and grabbed his truck keys from the hook by the door. I stepped forward, panicked, not knowing what I should do or say. "John, please," I started, but he shook his head sharply, stopping me in my tracks. Without another word, he walked out the front door. Seconds later, I heard the engine roar to life and his truck peel out of the driveway, red taillights disappearing into the night. I stood there trembling, my hand pressed to my mouth. I wanted to run after him into the darkness, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I collapsed onto a chair, then onto the kitchen floor, a wailing sound coming out of me that hardly seemed human. That night was the longest of my life. I sat by the front window until the sky started to lighten, whispering prayers into the empty room and hoping he would come back. He returned the next morning, just after dawn. I heard the door creak open and I hurried into the living room. John looked utterly exhausted. There were dark circles under his bloodshot eyes, and he smelled faintly of whiskey and sleepless nights. My heart leapt with both relief and fear at seeing him. He looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he simply said in a hoarse voice, "I don't want to talk. Not yet." I nodded, wiping my eyes. He grabbed a spare blanket and a pillow from the closet and settled himself on the couch. I stood there in the doorway, unsure what to do. I wanted to hold him, to apologize 1,000 more times, but I knew I couldn't push him. He lay down facing the wall, his back to me. A quiet sob escaped my throat as I watched this proud, strong man curl up in pain. I had no idea if he would ever forgive me or even speak to me again. For a week, we lived under the same roof in agonizing silence. John couldn't even look at me without tears in his eyes. Finally, he decided he had to leave to clear his head. He packed a bag and went to stay with his brother in Missouri. I wanted to beg him to stay, but I knew I had no right after what I'd done. A few months later, he filed for divorce. I signed the papers with a shaking hand, knowing I had destroyed our marriage with one terrible choice. Just like that, the life we had dreamed of together was gone. In the years that followed, I lived quietly and alone. I moved to a new town, took a job in a library, and kept to myself. I never remarried. I felt I didn't deserve a second chance at love. Through mutual friends, I heard that John never remarried either. Our wounds ran deep, and neither of us seemed able to fully trust again. I tried to atone for my mistake in small ways, throwing myself into kind deeds and community work, but nothing could truly erase my guilt or the ache of losing him. As the decades passed, my guilt remained my constant companion. Every year on Veterans Day, I would think of John and the sacrifices he made. I'd picture him standing in a parade or visiting a war memorial, and I'd feel a pang of sorrow knowing I hadn't been worthy of his sacrifice. Sometimes I would whisper an apology into the empty room. "I'm so sorry, John," as if somehow it might reach him across the miles. I carried the weight of my regret through my 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way into my old age. By 2010, more than 40 years had passed since our divorce. I was in my mid-60s, living alone with my memories, and I realized that I might not have all the time in the world to make amends. The burden of not having sought John's forgiveness had become too heavy. I decided I needed to at least try to tell him the words I'd wanted to say for so long. So I sat down and wrote him a letter. I poured my heart onto the page. I told him I was sorry, truly, deeply sorry, for the pain I caused. I acknowledged that I had no right to expect anything from him, but I wanted him to know that what I did was about my weakness and not any failing of his. I wanted him to know that he had been a wonderful husband and that my betrayal was my own doing. I told him I understood if he could never forgive me, but that I hoped he had found happiness in life because he deserved every bit of it. When I mailed that letter, my hands were shaking. I didn't even know if the address I had for him was current. All I could do was send it off and pray. A few weeks later, my phone rang on a quiet morning. When I answered, a familiar warm voice simply said, "Maggie?" My breath caught in my throat. It was John. I almost couldn't speak through the lump that formed instantly. "It's me," I finally managed to reply, and then I just started crying. "I got your letter," he said gently. I could hear that he was choking up too. He and continued, "Thank you for writing it." I cannot describe the relief and emotion that flooded me, hearing his voice after so many years. I must have apologized a dozen times in that call. John, ever the kind soul, actually comforted me. He told me that he'd been angry for a long time after everything, but as years went by, that anger had cooled. He said he had decided to forgive me in his heart, because holding on to all that bitterness only hurt him in the end. Hearing him say, "I forgive you," brought me to uncontrollable sobs. I think we both cried on that phone call. Tears of sorrow for all the hurt, but also tears of release. After that, we agreed to meet in person. In truth, I think we both needed to see each other face to face at least once more in our lives. We chose to meet at a small park in our hometown, near a pond where we used to feed ducks in simpler times. I was so nervous waiting on that bench, my heart thumping like I was a teenager on a first date. Then I saw him walking toward me, a little slower than he used to, hair silver and lines on his face, just like me. We were both old now, but when our eyes met, I saw the same John I had fallen in love with all those years ago. He told me about his life as a mechanic in Missouri, and I shared a bit about mine. We even managed a soft laugh or two as we reminisced about some fond memories from our youth. Then we gently addressed the lingering shadow between us. John admitted that for a long time he'd wondered if something was wrong with him, if he hadn't been enough for me, and that was why I strayed. I felt tears spring to my eyes when he said that, and I firmly told him it was never that. He had always been more than enough. He had been a wonderful husband. It was my own weakness and fear that led to my mistake. He nodded, swallowing hard, and said he appreciated hearing that. We talked openly about everything, finally, with no more secrets. As the sun started to set, John and I stood up from that park bench. In that golden evening light, he reached out and pulled me into a gentle hug. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I was 21 again, hugging the man I loved and saying goodbye at a bus station. Only this time, it wasn't a goodbye full of despair. It was a goodbye full of understanding. "Take care of yourself, Maggie," he whispered softly as he held me. I smiled through my tears. "You too, John." When we parted, I felt a weight lift off my soul. We didn't make plans to become deeply involved in each other's lives again. Too many years and miles had separated us. But we parted as friends. In the years that followed, we stayed in touch with the occasional phone call or holiday card. Each time I felt warmth, not angst. It was a quiet, gentle epilogue to a story that had seen so much turmoil. Now it's 2025, and I am 79 years old. I often reflect on the winding path my life has taken. It wasn't a fairy tale, far from it. I lost the man I loved due to my own mistakes. And I carried that regret for most of my life. Yet in the end, I also witnessed the incredible power of forgiveness. John and I didn't get to live out our days side by side on that porch swing we dreamed about. But we made peace with each other. We found a way to close a chapter that had been left painfully open. By sharing my story, I hope it might help someone. I learned that no matter how badly you falter, it's never too late to seek forgiveness and try to make things right. I learned that love is not a straight line. Sometimes it's messy and it hurts, but it's also resilient. And I learned that carrying guilt for a lifetime is its own kind of punishment. Sometimes the only way to heal is to confront the truth, as hard as it may be. If you've wronged someone, don't assume it's hopeless. True forgiveness can take time, even years, but it can happen. And if you've been wronged, know that forgiveness isn't weakness. It can free your heart from a prison of anger. Thank you for listening to my story. It hasn't been easy to revisit these memories. But if my experiences can touch even one heart or prevent one mistake, then sharing it was worth it.